I'm just checking now.
Looks good.
Okay. I think it's just checking now. Oh, yeah. Okay. There's the delay.
Looks good.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay.
Now let me wait. I gotta figure this out now. I think it's checking now. Oh, yeah. Okay. There's the delay.
Looks good.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay.
Now let me. Okay. Sorry, guys. Wait.
No worries.
I gotta figure this out now. Okay. I think I just have to close it. I hope I didn't just exit out of this.
It looks like it's still streaming. If I look up on the top left,
You can see it. Okay.
I like that I'm backwards. So
This is a new experience for me.
yeah,
Every time I hold on, I'm just checking the page myself now. Yeah, it says we're live.
wonderful.
I have no, okay, yeah, looks good. Okay, no idea if anyone's watching. Um, that's totally fine if they're not. Okay, we will just carry on. All right.
Wonderful.
Let me I have a slide. Let me share my screen. I have just one like intro slide.
Wonderful.
Okay. Oops, I didn't do that right. There we go. Do you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, cool. So, hello everybody. Welcome to our first live YouTube. I am Liz Marfia Ash, president of GRIN2B Foundation, and tonight we are talking about clinical trial frequently asked questions. And so we have some questions that we've put together. Some of them I put together based on conversations I saw from parents in our private Facebook support group. And then some of them we just came up with additional questions to add to that list. So we're going to go through this list. And so here with me tonight are two people from GRIN Therapeutics, Hillary and Mike, and I will let you guys each introduce yourself, and then I'll stop sharing. We don't need the slide for this.
Okay. Mike, do you wanna go first?
Why don't you go first, Hillary?
Okay, thank you. So I'm Hillary Savoy. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Communications at GRIN Therapeutics. I've been with GRIN since day one, which is really exciting and unusual, I think, for an advocacy lead to be involved right from the start, and it speaks very much to who we are as a company, I think. And I've had the good fortune of getting to work with Liz since basically day one as well, and getting to know through Liz and other advocates in the space, the GRIN community. Prior to joining GRIN, I was an advocate in my own organization, much the way that Liz is. I ran an organization called the Acute Syndrome Foundation that I started in honor of my daughter, Esme, who has a disorder that's believed to be genetic, although undiagnosed, that is a developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. So working with the GRIN community is, of course, deeply personal for me as well. And it's always a joy to get to join Liz and talk to the community and connect around some really important issues, which I think we're going to dive into today. So that's me, and off to you, Mike.
Great, thanks. So, hello everyone. My name is Mike Panzera. I'm a physician and neurologist, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer of GRIN Therapeutics. Been doing clinical trials and development of medicines for neurological diseases for a little over 20 years now. And what a chief medical officer does is really, I'm the one who is the most senior medical person, most senior physician at a company. And it's my responsibility to make sure that everything we're doing is aligned with the rules and regulations, with patient safety, first and foremost, and to ensure that all of our clinical trials are done appropriately to be the lead clinical trial expert, if you will, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. So thanks for being here. Thank you for having us here.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us, Hillary and Mike. And I also just wanted to add that just to reiterate, so tonight we're talking about just clinical trial, frequently asked questions just in general. We're not talking specifically to any one trial. And just to give a little background, so last year we did our first 5-year strategic plan. And one of the goals that we talked about for the future was to help get our community clinical trial ready. And so, and that's a term, clinical trial readiness, that I've seen thrown around for many years now, and I didn't fully understand like what it meant, like or why it was such a big deal. Like, why do I need to get people ready for clinical trials? Like, it's just a clinical trial. Like, what's the big deal? But I think over the last year, just became more aware of how complicated the whole process is, and um, just there's just a lot of things that the average person just would never know. And so we are in a really wonderful position where we have the clinical trial through GRIN Therapeutics, the Honeycomb trial, which is currently enrolling patients in Europe and will be hopefully, I don't know what they're allowed to say, but um, eventually will be coming to other countries. And so that will be something that people will have, in the US will eventually have a chance to find out if they can do. And then we also have a trial going on in Spain that I know many families have been able to participate in, or if they can't participate locally, then they've been able to have their doctor kind of get the information for that trial. So at this time, we're not talking anything specific to any one trial. It's just general clinical trial questions. And certainly down the road, there will be opportunities to ask specific trial questions, especially at the conference this summer. We should have presentations on both trials. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then also really quick, I am going to share my screen one more time. And just going to say that if people have questions, they can email them to me and we'll forward them on to the team at GRIN Therapeutics. And I'll put this back up on the screen at the end. So let's get started. Okay. All right, guys. So what is the purpose of a clinical trial?
Well, I can start with that. I mean, I think clinical trials are usually carried out in human beings after there's been a lot of work in the laboratory, both in petri dishes and like in vitro, it's called, or in animal testing to show that a therapy is doing what it's supposed to do, at least in the preclinical, as we call it, setting, because you want to make sure that what you're going to bring into human beings is you know enough about it to administer it safely with the potential for benefit in humans. So they involve usually volunteers, not usually, always volunteers that are they volunteer themselves to participate to evaluate these treatments for diseases. They're conducted over a series of phases, from smaller studies, usually either in healthy people or a few patients with the disease, and increasing number of people throughout over time, once more and more is learned to make sure that the potential therapy is safe and, in the end, effective. They move through very, very defined, structured plans that we call protocols. And these protocols are specifically written, and we'll go into that a little bit more later, I think, to talk about so that they evaluate the specific attributes, the specific things about the particular investigational drug. These protocols are written and reviewed, whether reviewed by health authorities, meaning like the FDA, EMA, other regulatory authorities, as well as ethics committees, or IRBs, they're called, institutional review boards, to make sure that they are scientifically rigorous and they adhere to ethical standards, because again, you want to make sure human subjects are protected, and to ensure that the trial results are as clear as possible. Now, with that, there's often confusion about a clinical trial versus clinical care, and they're very different things. A clinical trial is an experiment. There are a lot of unknowns, exciting opportunity to participate and learn, but also some unknowns, and it's not the same as clinical care, and there's uncertainty, and we can talk about that more as we go through the questions today. And I would say that the important thing is also that health authorities have very, very strict regulations and guidelines that have to be followed, again, with the sole purpose of protecting participants from unreasonable risks and to ensure that the potential benefits of therapy and the severity of disease outweigh any potential risk of being in the trial.
Perfect. That was great. I think that's the really important designation for me, is that it's not clinical care. And I think can be the common misconception. Okay. So piggybacking on that, does entering into a clinical trial mean that there is a chance that my child will see a benefit?
So I'll start with that, and then I'll turn it over to Hillary. In a trial, it is a trial and it's experiment. So no, there is no guarantee that someone who participates in a clinical trial will experience benefit. And some clinical trials actually include what's called a placebo group, which is like a sugar pill or saline or something inert. And some patients don't even receive any experimental medicine at all. But that comparator, that placebo group, is required for us to understand if the actual experimental medicine is working. So a clinical trial may also compare a new treatment to one that is standard treatment, and as I mentioned, or to placebo. So it is that comparison that's very important. And when you have that, there's a chance that the person in the comparator group won't benefit, but there's a chance that even the drug doesn't work. So there is that unknown when participating in a trial. And I'll turn over to Hillary.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's one of the challenging things also about a clinical trial is understanding that because it's an experiment, when you participate, it's actually the most likely outcome is that you're helping developers and scientists and other researchers learn something that helps them in the future. And I think that that's, also very, very important for families to understand.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. So what questions do clinical trials answer?
Well, there's a lot of important questions that actually the trials seek to answer. Really, paramount is whether these experimental products are safe enough to outweigh the risks related to the condition, because we want to make sure that the medicines that we eventually physicians prescribe to people benefit in the end. So that's a very important question that's usually answered later in the course of development. It also important things about how the drug should be used. So what is the right dose? And people know when they get a medicine, there's a dose they're given. Well, that's because there's lots of doses that are explored and lots of frequencies, meaning how often it's given, all during that experimental period, both in animals and human beings, to try and figure out what the right dose is, because too much can lead to side effects. Too little, you don't have any benefit. So it's a balance of that benefit risk. And you're going to hear that more and more about a trial and what a trial's measuring, which is the benefit and risk. And that benefit could be relieving symptoms. It could be treating the underlying cause of the disease and hopefully changing the course of the disease. And so that's really what we're trying to do as we, over time, continue to advance these medicines through experiments that get bigger, involve more patients, ask more complicated questions, because that's what it takes for a regulatory authority like the FDA to be able to know if they should approve it. Because once clinical trials may have 10, 15, 20, 50 people. But once it's on the market, a lot more people get it. So it's very important to answer those questions early on. And I mean, in rare disease, it's particularly challenging. Hillary, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's also really important for families to understand. And you hear about large clinical trials. Of course, we've just gone through COVID, so we understand really, really large trials. But trials in rare diseases and newly characterized diseases are particularly difficult to carry out because it actually isn't always clear what the progress of the disease would be, the natural history of the disease. It isn't always clear what measures are appropriate to show improvement in the community. And the scarcity of the people living with the disorder mean that as you're moving through these trial steps and needing to enroll more and more patients, it can be hard to get enough participants to answer the questions that Mike is talking about. And it can be a very large challenge for a trial.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, guys. Okay, so let's talk about inclusion and exclusion criteria. What are they? How are they decided and why are they important?
Okay, so here comes Chief Medical Officer, sort of guy who has to put the rules and disappoint people. But that's basically inclusion and exclusion are rules. I mean, that is, in short, what they mean is these are the requirements for a participant, for a person, a child, to enter a study. And we typically break them down into inclusion, so those things that you need to have to be included, and exclusion, those things you can't have to be included. And so that's, the structure is added to the trials because they need to be designed. A study has to be designed to ensure that the participants enrolled are appropriate. This is an experiment again. And based on a person's current health record, we want to make sure that they're safe, but also studies are designed to answer a question, as we've just said, and sometimes that question has to be answered in subpopulations, so some parts of the population, so that we can understand in a more narrow group how something works, so that we can then expand and understand how it might work in a broader group. So research sites that's the different hospitals, medical centers around the world that are involved in these studies. They have to follow those rules of inclusion and exclusion because those rules, again, are mandated by the regulatory authorities and ethics committees to make sure that the experiment is appropriate and patients are not put at risk. And going outside of those inclusion criteria can sometimes put patients at better risk and actually more risk. And actually, if the enrolling patients that don't meet that inclusion exclusion criteria can actually invalidate the study's results, which is why everybody gets really concerned about making sure the inclusion exclusion criteria are followed. Again, an inclusion criteria, things that a patient has to have, and exclusion are things a person can't have, and participants need to meet all of those criteria. And if they have any of them, there may be like 40 criteria, but if they have any of them, they just can't get in. And again, that's and the risk of including someone who doesn't meet leads to those risks I've mentioned. Now, what inclusion and exclusion could be, that could be the age of a person, that could be presence of certain symptoms, because obviously if a person doesn't have symptoms of a disease that are overt, it's kind of hard to know if your drug works in those people. So people often have to have some level of disease activity. Sometimes there's restrictions on medicines. Sometimes people are, for a given study, sometimes patients who are earlier in the disease will enter a certain study, but sometimes studies want people who are later in the disease. Sometimes a study will want certain comorbidities, meaning certain associated symptoms, and sometimes a study will not want those symptoms. It really depends upon what the scientific question is being answered. How do we come up with these things? We talk to physicians, we talk to independent leaders in the area, we speak with advocates throughout the community. And very importantly, the regulators are very specific with what they want too. So we have a lot of stakeholders we need to satisfy. And again, it's not because we want to exclude anyone, it's because we want the results to be scientifically rigorous, and as the regulators call them, interpretable, to understand what the effect is and understand what the safety profile is so it can be managed effectively. The unfortunate part is sometimes these things can't be assessed until a person is already in what we call the screening period. So that's that period where someone gets kind of seen the first time, they sign that consent form, which we'll get into what a consent form is. They're all excited to get into the study. They get in this period where they've signed up because they've actually signed, and then something is seen during that period, and then they can never get dosed. And it's super disappointing. It's the worst feeling to know that that can happen when someone's finally got that mental strength to say, I'm going to enter an experiment, and that hope it does happen that even during that period, something will be found that an inclusion or exclusion criteria can't be met. And for that particular study, unfortunately, the person can't participate. So again, it's a lot to digest. I went through a lot of things there. I think the overarching message, though, is that as we try to design these experiments, we design them in a way that ensures that when a human being commits themselves or a child to this, that there's the best chance of a benefit and the least chance of risk.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was super thorough. That was very helpful. So yeah, so just to quickly sum it up in like the most basic way possible, there's very specific reasons why you're coming up with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And obviously, as you just said, there's lots of people involved in coming up with that, and it's not arbitrary and it's not meant to
keep people out.
keep people out. It's for safety and it's to answer these scientific questions in the best way possible. So there's reasons for all of it. And then you did touch on the consent and how someone could have consented and then they find out later or through the initial, I don't know what we call that first phase process. Screening, yes, through the screening process. So that kind of leads into the next thing is what is the process to get enrolled?
Yeah.
Because I think there's confusion about that too, which I had confusion on my end.
Yeah, well, and I think there's with good reason, right? There's a number of steps that are involved, and because this is an experiment, because this is such a big deal, and because of all of the reasons that Mike outlined with respect to ensuring that you have someone enrolling that has all of the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria, there's a bunch of steps that are involved. So really the first step is just finding out about the trial, right? Which is in some instances takes some time, right? So it's the first moment that a caregiver or a patient is aware that there's a trial, whether their doctor hears about the trial and thinks they meet some of the basic criteria and reaches out and suggests it, or if they hear about it through a patient organization that's talking about available trials in the community, or they might hear about it from one of the databases that lists what clinical trials are available. For instance, clinicaltrials.gov has a list of keyword searchable trials. So that's really the first step is identifying the trial and the potential interest and connecting with the principal investigator and the site that they may go and visit. And the next step is, of course, actually going to see the site, going to the site for what's called screening. And so as Mike said, this is the point at which a patient comes in, they sign the informed consent form, and they start to have these discussions about whether they meet those criteria, both before they sign the form and after they sign the form. There may be some testing that's done at that screening visit to determine if they're eligible. And then in some trials that may be followed by a screening period. So that's sort of step 3. So you get to that screening period where symptoms might be followed over a period of time to continue to confirm eligibility. So something like seizure count would be followed during that portion of time to be sure that the patient had enough seizures to enroll in the trial. And during that time, they're monitored. Going through the screening process, as Mike said, it does not confirm eligibility or guarantee enrollment in the trial. And enrollment only occurs after all of the screening steps are complete, and it's determined that the patient still meets the criteria and they are dosed. So there's a many step process involved in that. And each one of those might involve more than what I've just outlined, right? It might be many calls to the site or conversations with the site before a patient comes in for screening. So it is multi-step, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That was very clear. But you talked about informed consent.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What is that?
Yeah.
Sure, I can take that. I mean, this is such an important part of the process, because this is the part where your rights as a participant are made clear. This is where the participant in the study or their family, their caregiver, has to confirm a willingness to participate in the trials, acknowledging that this is a trial. They have to be informed of all aspects of the trial. There's a legacy in clinical trials where some of the information from trials hasn't always been shared, but now that is not the way anymore. This is all aspects of the trial are relevant, and that are relevant to the subject's decision and their family's decision to participate. The known potential risks and potential benefits have to be described, and this is documented. It's documented as a written, signed form contract that says, as of that date, there's an acknowledgement of this information. I mean, it is voluntary, and it's important, and it's voluntary to get into the study, and you can leave whenever you want from the study. I mean, it is truly a volunteer system where you're expressing a willingness after everything's explained, after you understand why you're doing it, the willingness to participate. So you have to understand the purpose of the research, what's involved, the procedures themselves, because sometimes there's a lot of burden of time, effort to participation. And you have the right to know everything you have to do, all those obligations, all those questionnaires, all the potentially overnight monitoring. There's a lot of stuff that happens in a trial that is important people think about before entering. So again, if there's some major steps that are outlined there. The length of participation is included, all the procedures, and then when a child is involved, it's a bit more complicated, but the parent has to give consent on behalf of the child. Now, depending on the age and depending on the capabilities, there's another process called assenting. So if a child is able to sort of understand some basic information, depending on the age, there's an expectation that the child has to, when capable, if old enough, assent to what their parents are committing them to when they can. And so we typically will have forms for different ages where the forms for an adult are written and described. The forms for children are often pictures and other helpful tools to help the child understand what's going to be happening to them, because that's a very special thing we want to be very careful of in pediatric research. So I just go back to it being so important that it's really your opportunity to ask all the questions, make sure anything that you're unsure about is answered. And if you're unsure about something, you don't have to do it. And it's a very important part of the process.
Okay, that was great. Thank you for explaining the part about assent, because I had that question. Okay, so what should parents think about before enrolling?
Yeah, so that gets to what Mike just talked about, that the opportunity from when you learn about a trial and you start to consider it, the things you might want to think through, all the way up to the point at which you're deciding to sign an informed consent. There's a bunch of questions that you might have. It's a deeply personal decision, and it's important to ask any questions and think through the choice prior to making it. I think there's a few sort of buckets of questions that a parent might want to think about. So this is the purpose of the study, right? So what is the main question that this trial is trying to answer, and making sure that they understand that, and have any questions about that answered. I think the logistics are a really big set of questions, right? How long will I be doing this? How frequently will I need to travel to a site? What's in place to help me do that? Will there be costs or reimbursement associated with that travel? And what systems are in place to help me with that? There's also the question of care. So can you continue to see your regular physician, get your regular care, take your regular medications? Questions about the chance of being in a placebo group. Would you be receiving placebo? Would you possibly know that you're receiving placebo? And then I think there's a lot of questions around your data. So will I be informed of my child's individual results, or my own results? How will my data be used in the future? How is it safeguarded? Questions about that are also really important, and families have every right to ask any of those questions and any others that they can come up with.
Great.
And I think another one, sorry to add on, just not to interrupt you, but I think the other big question that families often have and should ask is what happens if the treatment is working for their child, and can they continue if that's the case?
And that's different. Is that answer different trial by trial?
Yes, trial by trial. Every trial is different, and the rules that govern that trial and the protocol can be different. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this next one is a bit of a hot topic in our community. Can families participate in clinical trials in other countries, and what would some limitations be?
Yeah. So this is a really important question as well, and just like the previous answer, every trial is going to be different. So every trial is going to have different rules. And there are reasons that, as Mike said, there's all of these rules involved in a trial, and they exist to make the results of the trial as clear as possible and keep everyone as safe as possible. And participating in another country could be limited, have rules limiting that for any number of reasons. They could include language barriers, the frequency of the visits or the burden of the trial, the duration of the trial, regulations around shipment of the investigational product, either within a country or across country borders, and access to healthcare and insurance in another country. And, sort of diving in a little bit deeper on some of these, that might not be obvious why these are challenges, but we've just walked through why informed consent is so important and clarity around that. So providing informed consent in another language is potentially very complicated. Speaking to the sort of scientific rigor, in a clinical trial, there's often a series of questionnaires and surveys that families have to answer. And those surveys are designed typically and validated in a particular language. And answering those surveys or questionnaires in a different language or having them interpreted could invalidate those results. And so it's really important that a language difference is also thought about as from a data perspective is really important. And another issue that could arise is something like switching time zones frequently with a time-sensitive medication could potentially risk unexpected results in a study. So all of these pieces are, as Mike said, there's rules that govern any particular trial and why decisions are made within that trial, specific to, in this instance, moving from country to country potentially. So.
Okay. Yeah. As we've been saying, it's very complicated. It's never
I
as
know it
simple
is.
as you think it's going to
It's a
be.
very complicated
And
thing.
certainly it seems like the regulations which we want to have because they make us safe, but they also complicate everything and make it kind of put some limitations in place. Um, okay, so do the different clinical trial sites have their own set of rules from each other?
Well, sure, I can address that one. I mean, yes, that there are different requirements at different sites because in different countries of the world, there are different ways of um, practicing medicine and different, quite frankly, resource constraints at different sites. So the decision regarding a participation of patients in a study and how they're managed rests completely with the clinical trial sites. The investigator, the physician, the principal investigators, they call are legally responsible for the patients under his or her care. And they have to legally verify that they've followed the protocol and that they stand by the data generated at their site. So how they do that individually is going to be based upon how they run their operation at their center. The sponsor, that's the biotechnology company, the pharmaceutical company, us, basically anybody who is involved in the development of the drug. We are actually prohibited by law from directly knowing who's participating in the studies and making medical decisions specific to individual study participants. As I've said early on, we were involved in all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the structure of the protocol, how the data is collected, how the data is analyzed. But that's where it stops. There's a firewall between us and the individual sites, and all of the medical decision making and all of those final decisions completely rest with the site. So patients are anonymized with a number, and that's as much as we know is the number. And the sites just follow the guidelines of the protocol that's reviewed and approved by the regulators. And again, we try to put those protocols together so that things are standardized about across sites in terms of the type of patients recruited, in terms of how they're taken care of and protected. But the individual care is again completely in the hands, and decision making completely in the hands of the site. A given site may be able to enroll one patient or 10 patients. It really depends upon how their resources are. And you may find that a site is right near you that you want to participate in, and they only have enough staff to do a couple people. So they decide that they have recruited enough, and that's the best they can do. And they've made that decision because they feel that's the number they can manage safely. And because there's a data intensive element to this, there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of triple checking of information that you need a very structured setup in a hospital to do the experiment properly. So they manage all of that also. And on top of that, as I said, different countries have their own rules, and clinical trial sites within a country may have their own rules if they're a university hospital versus a private practice. And again, it's mostly due to staffing resources. I mean, I think just summarizing all of this, I don't think we're here to say that this is so complicated. Oh my God, we're scare everybody away from clinical trials. That's not what we're trying to do by any means. But it is, but I think it is to say, I mean, we value the willingness of people to participate in trials, and the impact of participating in clinical trial has on the broader community can't even be overstated how important that is. But I think we also try to make sure everybody's very aware and comfortable with the level of commitment to it. And I think that it is really a gift to the community by participating in a clinical trial, and we're grateful for people who are interested. The contribution is incredible, and that's how medicines make it to the market. So.
Mhm. Yeah, okay. There's something you said there that I actually didn't know, but now I forgot what it was.
Huh.
But something you said there, I was like, oh. Oh, I think it was the part about the individual site could decide that they only have the capability of enrolling 2 people, and there could be someone that lives right there that doesn't get to enroll. That I would never have known that.
No, I
Uh,
think a site that is professional enough to acknowledge that, we appreciate that, because what
right.
happens is if they overload their staff, then not only are the data maybe not great, the risk to patients is greater, and the patient experience is really unpleasant. And, it's hard enough to have to follow all these rules, but if the site is inefficient at implementing them because they're just not resourced appropriately, it could be really unpleasant. Now, we watch for that, by the way. We watch for that type of thing. If a site over enrolls, we can provide resource. We are on demand to provide resource because we want to make sure that the study is done appropriately to the highest quality. So we do monitor. We send people out to all the sites in the world to check on how they're doing. And if we find something that's a little not right, we intervene. And
Okay.
for the patient and for the data quality.
Okay. And just in case people aren't familiar with the lingo, I think you explained it earlier, but I'll just explain it again, that when we talk about sites, we're talking about the actual, it would be like a hospital.
Hospital, a university hospital,
You're
a
going to,
private practice. Sometimes there's large private practices. Yes,
okay.
facility.
And like you said, each of those sites has a principal investigator, which is a
The legally responsible. Generally, we require there be a legally responsible individual in charge, have coordinators, nurse coordinators are sometimes called. They're the ones who really do all the nuts and bolts work and documentation, and a series of backup investigators. We call them sub investigators or sub-Is, you'll hear them referred to, that are basically additional physician resources in case the principal investigator is unavailable. We require backups at all levels.
okay. That makes sense. So yeah, so again, yeah, the point of all this was not to scare people, but just to better prepare everyone for what it is. It's an experiment, it's an investment. I mean, I have no experience personally, but just from what I've learned over the past few weeks, um, it would be, there's more to it than just I'm a parent who wants to try a drug for my child, which, all of us are, and all of us, you know, want that, but it's not without its,
Mhm.
like you said, risks and benefits.
And
Um,
we as sponsors try to create as much at the sites themselves, as much resources as said to make the experience as positive as possible. Like we create, I mean, we survey and we ask, what can make this easier for you? As Hillary alluded to, how can we help you get there? How can we help you get a place to stay and for you and whatever caregivers you need to come with you. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. So in the end, many families, even though it's tough, it's a different level of medical care that actually that is one of the benefits. You are watched better than you've ever been watched in your entire life, and the care you get is going to be the top care, medical care you
right.
can get, because you got a lot of people watching you and taking care of you. And that's, if there is a benefit, that may be one of the ones we hear most about.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of it that way. Are you guys allowed to take another question or no?
Okay. We're here. So, you got us, so go ahead.
I think we sort of talked about this. You sort of touched on it, Hillary, and so maybe you'll have a general answer to this, but someone is asking what happens after the clinical trial if the drug is successful? Is the patient able to stay on the drug? And I'm sure that's case by case.
That's a good question. Mike, you want to?
Sure, I can take. So what happens is case by case, but is generally expected that, especially in the case of a drug that where you're treating a serious disease, that if the drug shows benefit, that it is generally made available in a study, like still in a study structure, up till the time the drug is approved and available through normal means, through your physician. That's pretty standard. Does it always happen that way? No, but in the expectation in general is that if you have a person who's participated in your study and the benefit risk has been determined favorable, which means that doesn't mean they think it's working. That means the data proves that it's working, right? Uh, Generally, companies will make it available in a clinical trial setting up till the time it's approved. If it doesn't get approved, that's when the benefit risk doesn't support it anymore, and generally then it does not become available.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Yeah, and we didn't talk about that at all, about how after the trial ends and there's an approval period to get it officially, I don't know what the term is, approved.
Actually, yeah, so generally there's about a 8 to 15 month period following the application submission to the regulatory authorities before a drug is available on the market. So that's after about another 6 months to a year after the end of the study. So you're talking about a 1.5 to 2 year process after a trial is complete. And that's that gap that
Mm,
is often filled by availability of the drug in a clinical setting when it works. If it
mhm.
doesn't work, then there's risks outweigh benefits, and generally it's not made available. There can be.
And Mike, it might be helpful to clarify when you say for that sort of extension period, when you say in a clinical trial setting, there's a difference, right, between the primary clinical trial portion where it's really rigorous, there's a lot of visits, there's a lot of things happening, and then that period that might stretch for a year or two if someone was showing benefit. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
That's a good point, Hillary. So often what happens in a trial is you have this phase of the trial, which is the controlled phase, which is the minimum requirement to get the drug reviewed by a regulatory authority and approved. They're generally very structured and accepted timeframes. What happens after that rigorous period, there's often a safety extension period where the safety monitoring in terms of how close we watch is the same because the drug still isn't approved, but there may be less procedures, there may be less visits, there may be less travel. And really, it's about making sure that patients are safe, more, I'd say in a little bit more of a real world setting than the ultra frequent, ultra intense core study period. So that's that period in between completion of a study and eventual regulatory review and approval, where the drug is often made available in a trial setting, but the intensity of visits and travel may be a little different, depending on, again, the safety of the drug. If it's a drug that has safety issues, you're still going to have a lot of monitoring. If it's a drug that appears to be well tolerated, that monitoring may be adjusted. All of it is really, it's so case by case. And I think we're speaking and trying to speak in some generalities, but every trial and every drug is going to be a little bit different.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Well, that is all the questions I had. And I don't see anything else unless I'm missing it. I don't know. If someone emailed me a question, I haven't seen it yet. And I won't.
You can always pass along any questions that come up from the community. We're happy to answer to the, through you in any way, shape, or form that we can.
Okay.
Of course,
Happy
want to make sure that
follow up if there's some follow-up questions.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm just gonna put my email back up. So if anyone wants to email me, any follow-up questions, go ahead and I'll get them answered. And thank you guys for joining. This was really helpful. Super informative. Glad that this lives on our YouTube channel so I can, share it with people who have clinical trial questions going forward. So yeah, thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday evening to do this.
No, Thank you very much for inviting us. It's really important conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So absolutely our pleasure. And I think, yeah, as Mike said, it's a really important conversation. So we're happy to have it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thanks,
Have a great
Liz.
weekend.
Good night.
Enjoy your weekend.